She didn't notice the cameras anymore. She only felt the weight of the day on her shoulders as she stepped off the set, mascara smudged, heart somewhere between exhaustion and quiet loneliness. On the other side of the lot, he was finishing another fight sequence, breath heavy, knuckles bruised in that familiar way that reminded him how pretending to be strong was so much easier than actually being okay. The first time Charlize Theron and Keanu Reeves crossed paths on that studio lot, it wasn't with movie magic slow motion or a dramatic music swell. It was in that strange in-between space after work, where the makeup is half wiped off and the smiles aren't public ready anymore. Charlize had just spent an entire day pretending to be fearless in front of a camera, yet the moment she was alone in the hallway, she felt how thin her armor really was. Keanu, dragging a worn leather bag over his shoulder, noticed the way she leaned against the wall, eyes closed, as if she were trying to remember who she was before people turned her life into headlines. He almost kept walking. That was his habit. Stay quiet, stay small, don't intrude. But something in her posture, strong yet tired, like someone who had carried too much for too long, pulled him back. He stopped, cleared his throat softly, and offered the only thing he could think of, "Long day." She opened her eyes, expecting a casual co-star, a rehearsed nicety, and found instead a gaze that didn't flash to her clothes, or her hair, or her fame. He just looked at her like a person. For a second, she almost said, "I'm fine," the automatic lie every public figure learns to deliver on cue. Instead, to her own surprise, she laughed, a small, cracked laugh, and whispered, "Feels like the kind that doesn't end." There was an awkward, gentle silence between them, the kind that only happens when two people recognize something familiar in each other's pain. Keanu nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he wanted to admit, then shifted his bag higher on his shoulder. "Sometimes," he said, voice low, "the longest days are the ones where you look the most put together." Charlize studied him, caught off guard by the honesty hiding in such a simple sentence. In this industry, people usually offered solutions, advice, or distraction. Very few offered truth. She felt an instinctive pull to walk away before she became vulnerable in front of a near stranger. Yet there was something unnervingly safe about the way he stood there, giving her space instead of pressing for more. Without planning to, she heard herself ask, "And what do you do on those days?" The question landed heavier than she expected, because it wasn't about schedules or routines, it was about survival. Keanu blinked, that faint shadow passing behind his eyes, the shadow of losses and scars he rarely talked about. For a moment, he hesitated, as if deciding how much of himself he was willing to reveal in this dim, quiet hallway where the world wasn't watching, but where one person suddenly was, with genuine curiosity and a fragile kind of hope. He didn't answer right away. The hallway hummed with distant voices, the faint clatter of crew wrapping cables, doors closing one by one. Keanu shifted his weight, gaze drifting to the floor as if the answer might be written somewhere in the scuffed tiles. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, like he was touching something breakable. "I try to do one kind thing," he said, "for someone else. It doesn't fix anything, but it reminds me I'm still human." Charlize felt her throat tighten at the simplicity of it. In a world built on image, the idea of surviving the hardest days by turning outward instead of collapsing inward felt almost rebellious. She wanted to ask more, to open the door just a little wider into his world, but an assistant called her name from the far end of the corridor. The spell broke. The noise of production, the schedules, the urgency, all of it rushed back in. Keanu stepped back, giving her room to go, like he was already used to being the quiet footnote in other people's stories. "Anyway," he added, almost apologetically, "it's just my way. Might not work for everyone." She nodded, managing a small, grateful smile, but inside she wrestled with something deeper. The realization that despite the red carpets and interviews, she had forgotten how to be kind to herself, let alone anyone else, on days like this. Over the next few weeks, their paths kept crossing in small, almost accidental ways. A shared coffee cart at dawn, where he silently paid for the stranger behind him. A rehearsal space where she stayed late helping a nervous extra run lines for a scene she wasn't even in. Each time, they noticed the other noticing. Not the headlines, not the rumors, but the tiny, unglamorous moments where character quietly reveals itself. Charlize watched the way Keanu listened when people talked to him, really listened, as if their stories mattered more than his own. Keanu saw the way Charlize gave the same warmth to a makeup artist as she did to a director, how she never used her power to make someone feel small, even when she easily could have. Yet the more they recognized that shared softness, the more a new tension grew inside both of them. There was an unspoken risk in allowing someone close enough to see the cracks beneath the confidence. Charlize had spent years building a fortress of independence around herself. Strong, self-sufficient, untouchable. Letting someone step through that gate felt like an invitation to be heard again. Keanu, shaped by grief and loss, had mastered the art of staying on the edges of people's lives, caring deeply while quietly preparing to be left behind. They were drawn to each other like two guarded planets orbiting the same sun, careful never to collide. Then came the night everything shifted. A charity event, glittering and loud, the kind that pretended to be about compassion but mostly smelled like expensive perfume and subtle competition. Charlize was there as the honored guest, the cameras hungry for every angle. Keanu had agreed to attend only because the cause meant something to him, and because saying no had started to feel like its own kind of selfishness. They spotted each other across the room, a tiny pocket of familiarity in a sea of polished strangers, and for a moment, the chaos faded. She excused herself from a cluster of executives. He stepped away from a forced conversation about box office numbers. They met at the edge of the balcony, where the music was muffled and the city lights stretched out like an endless, restless ocean. "Did you do your one kind thing today?" Charlize asked softly, leaning on the railing, her dress shimmering under the faint glow. Keanu gave a half smile. "I'm working on it." She raised an eyebrow. "Working on it? It's almost midnight." He looked at her more carefully then, noticing the tightness at the corners of her eyes, the way she had been performing joy all evening. He realized that beneath the glamour, she was barely holding herself together. In that instant, his unstated rule, never get too involved, bumped hard against something he couldn't ignore, the instinct to protect someone who seemed so strong yet looked, right now, so close to breaking. He turned slightly, angling his body toward hers as if to shield her from the bright, watching room behind them. "How about this?" he said gently. "Tell me the truth about your day. Not the version you give them." The invitation hung in the air, heavier than any compliment or praise. Charlize's hand tightened around the stem of her glass. Truth was dangerous. Truth was messy. Truth meant letting someone see how much she doubted herself, how often the applause felt hollow, how loneliness sometimes echoed louder than any audience. Her instinct screamed at her to deflect, to joke, to change the subject. But then she remembered that first hallway, the way he had offered honesty without asking for anything in return. She took a breath that trembled more than she wanted him to notice. Her eyes drifted back to the party inside, where flashes popped and laughter rang out like rehearsed lines in a script everyone else seemed happy to follow. "The truth," she repeated quietly, turning back to him. "The truth is," her voice caught for a moment, suspended between the girl she used to be and the woman the world expected her to remain. And in that fragile pause, as the city lights flickered below and the night pressed in around them, she had to decide whether to keep armoring her heart, or to hand him a piece of it and trust he wouldn't let it fall. The truth slipped out of her before she could polish it. "The truth is I feel like I'm disappearing," Charlize whispered, eyes fixed on the city below. "Everyone sees this version of me, confident, fearless, in control. But when I go home, when the doors close, I feel like I'm fading. Like I'm playing a role even when the cameras are off." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Isn't that ridiculous? To have everything people dream about and still feel like you're not really there." The vulnerability in her voice startled even her. She wasn't used to hearing herself admit this out loud. Keanu didn't rush to comfort her, didn't try to correct her feelings or drown them in cliches. He just stood there, giving her the one thing she rarely received, space to be imperfect. "It's not ridiculous," he said finally. "It's honest." He hesitated, his jaw tightening as he searched for words he had trained himself not to say. "You know, there were years when I woke up and it felt like I was walking through someone else's life. Like I had to keep moving, keep working, or the grief would swallow me whole. People kept saying I was lucky, that I had it all. But there were days I would have traded every movie I'd ever made just to feel real again." His voice went quiet at the end, that last word almost swallowed, as if speaking it made the memories too sharp. She turned to him, really seeing him now. Not the calm, steady man the public adored, but someone who carried oceans behind his eyes. "What happened?" she asked softly, not out of curiosity, but out of a strange shared ache. Keanu looked away, that familiar reflex kicking in: protect, deflect, retreat. He could have shrugged it off, said, "It's a long story." Instead, he let a tiny piece of the wall drop. "I lost people I loved," he said. "More than once. When that happens, you start living with this quiet fear that everything good is temporary. That anyone you care about is one phone call away from being gone." He exhaled slowly. "So you keep your distance. You become the reliable one, the kind one, the steady one, but you don't let anyone get close enough to be taken away." The honesty hit her harder than she expected. She recognized that fear, not of losing others, but of losing herself. "You keep your distance," she repeated, her voice low. "I do the opposite. I try to control everything. Every narrative, every headline, every decision. If I can predict it, I can't be blindsided. At least that's what I tell myself." She swallowed, a flicker of old pain crossing her features. "I grew up in chaos, in fear. So now, I plan, I protect, I build walls out of work and ambition. People think it's strength. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it's just hiding in plain sight." They stood there in thick, fragile silence, two people the world believed they knew, quietly confessing how misunderstood they truly felt. Inside the ballroom, a host's voice rose above the din, announcing the start of the live auction. Applause burst out, laughter followed, and for a moment it felt like another universe. Out here, on the balcony, everything was stripped down to something raw and human. Keanu glanced at her, his expression softening with something close to recognition. "Maybe we are both hiding," he said. "Just in different ways." The idea lingered between them like a mirror neither had expected to face tonight. Then, as if the universe wanted to test whatever fragile trust was forming between them, a loud knock sounded against the glass door behind them. An event coordinator stepped out, slightly breathless, headset askew. "Charlize, they're ready for you," she said, urgency in her tone. "You're presenting the next segment, remember? They need you at the podium in 2 minutes." Charlize blinked, dragged back into her constructed life. She nodded, instinctively smoothing her dress, slipping the practiced smile back over her features like a mask she knew too well. But this time, she felt the weight of it differently. Like heavy armor she suddenly wasn't sure she wanted to wear. Keanu watched the transformation, the way her shoulders straightened, the way her eyes shifted from open and vulnerable to composed and camera-ready. It hurt more than he expected, seeing her disappear behind that performance, knowing what it cost her now that he'd seen the truth beneath. She turned to him, caught between worlds, one hand on the balcony railing, the other holding onto the fragile thread of their conversation. "I have to go," she said, her voice steady but her eyes searching his. "But, can we finish this? Not tonight, maybe. Just, someday." It was an offer and a plea, a small act of courage from someone not used to asking for emotional company. He nodded, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "I'll be around," he said simply. No promises he couldn't keep, no dramatic declarations. Just a quiet reassurance that he wouldn't vanish. She held his gaze a half-second longer than necessary, as if memorizing the safety she felt in it, then turned toward the door. As she stepped back into the roar of applause and flashing lights, the coordinator's hand on her elbow, the crowd rose to greet Charlize Theron, the icon. Out on the balcony, Keanu stayed where he was, staring at the doorway she disappeared through, fighting the familiar urge to step back into solitude, and realizing, with a faint unease, that for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Inside, the host's voice boomed her name to the crowd. She approached the microphone, smile flawless, posture perfect. But as the spotlight hit her, her heart skipped. Somewhere in the back of her mind, his words echoed, "You keep your distance. I become the steady one. We are both hiding." She looked out at the sea of expectant faces, about to deliver a scripted speech about hope and connection, while still deciding if she was brave enough to live a single sentence of it herself. And as the first line of her speech hovered on her tongue, she made a split-second choice that would either protect everything she'd built, or risk shattering the safe, polished version of herself the world thought it knew. She was supposed to start with a light joke. The teleprompter glowed just beneath the cameras, feeding her the safe, polished words her team had approved. Gratitude, inspiration, a charming anecdote. Charlize drew in a breath, let her rehearsed smile settle into place, then felt something inside her resist. She remembered the balcony air on her skin, the way her voice had trembled when she said, "I feel like I'm disappearing." Standing there under the blinding lights, she realized that if she read the script exactly as written, she'd be reinforcing the same lie that was slowly hollowing her out. Her fingers tightened around the sides of the podium. "Good evening," she began, voice steady, professional. A wave of applause washed over her. She glanced once at the prompter, then back at the audience. Instead of launching into the joke, she paused. It was only a heartbeat, but in a room choreographed down to the second, that silence felt enormous. "They gave me a very beautiful speech to read tonight," she said, lips curling into a small, rueful smile. "And I promise I will say most of it. But before I do, I want to share something that wasn't in the script." Murmurs flickered through the crowd. Producers in the back shifted nervously. Her publicist, watching offstage, stiffened. On the balcony outside, Keanu could hear the faint echo of her amplified voice drifting through the glass. He hadn't planned on listening. Events like this were usually predictable enough to ignore. But there was something in her tone that made him turn back toward the doors, moving a little closer, curiosity and concern pulling him in equal measure. "I stand on stages like this a lot," Charlize continued, her gaze sweeping across the glittering room, "and I talk about strength, resilience, courage. People call me fearless. But I want to be honest with you all tonight. Sometimes the bravest thing I do in a day is get out of bed and decide to keep being seen." A hush fell over the audience, the kind that comes when glamour briefly steps aside to make room for truth. She could feel her team's panic like a heat at the edge of the stage, but she pressed on, heart pounding. We talk about success like it erases our pain. Like awards and headlines magically cure loneliness, or fear, or grief. But that's not how it works. Not for me. Not for anyone in this room. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to hold eye contact with the crowd rather than retreat into autopilot. I've known chaos. I've known fear. I've known what it's like to build your entire life around the idea that if you just work harder, shine brighter, control more, you'll finally feel safe. But you know what actually makes me feel less alone? She thought of the hallway, of Keanu's quiet voice. It's the moments when someone drops the act and tells the truth. In the back, cameras zoomed in. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to this kind of rawness at a black tie gala. Others leaned in, faces softening, as if something in her confession mirrored their own private struggles. Outside, Keanu listened with growing unease. He hadn't expected his presence to stir something this visible in her. He'd only wanted to offer a small pocket of honesty, a safe place in a brutal industry. But now she was standing on a global stage, opening wounds that could just as easily be used against her as admired. A part of him admired her courage deeply. Another part worried she was stepping into a storm with no one to shield her when the spotlight cooled. Charlize felt the tremor in her hands, so she placed them flat on the podium where no one could see. Tonight's event is about hope, she said. About giving people a second chance, a lifeline, a reminder that they're not invisible. And standing here, I realize, I need that reminder too. So if you've ever felt like you're performing your life instead of living it, if you've ever gone home after a night like this and wondered why you still feel empty, this part of the speech is for you. Her vision blurred for a second. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fully fall. Vulnerability in a controlled space. This was the line she walked now, dangerous but strangely liberating. Then, just as she was about to pivot back to the prepared text, a phone somewhere near the front rang loudly, cutting through the reverent quiet like a slap. People shifted. Embarrassed laughter flickered. The spell cracked. Charlize stumbled over her next word, momentarily pulled out of the fragile rhythm she'd been building. The owner of the phone fumbled to silence it, cheeks flushed, but the damage was done. The moment of raw connection suddenly felt exposed, almost foolish, hanging naked in a room that was already itching to return to safety and spectacle. Doubt rushed in, sharp and fast. Had she said too much? Would they call her fragile, unstable, unprofessional? Backstage, her publicist exchanged a look with the event producer, a mix of irritation and concern. Notes were scribbled, schedules adjusted. Somewhere in that flurry, decisions were already being made about the narrative they would push tomorrow, about how to spin this off-script detour into something palatable. On the balcony, Keanu saw her falter, saw the way her shoulders dipped for a fraction of a second before she recovered. The instinct to stay out of it collided with something more urgent, the need to be there for her, not as a colleague or a co-star, but as the one person in this building who now knew what it cost her to be this honest. Charlize forced herself back into the prepared words, walking the line between heartfelt and composed. She delivered the rest of the speech with grace, drawing applause at the right beats, earning nods and smiles. But under the practiced rhythm, her mind churned, replaying every raw sentence she'd shared. Was that bravery? Or a mistake? When she finally stepped away from the microphone, the crowd rose to their feet for a standing ovation. To them, it was a powerful, moving moment. To her, it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff she'd just stepped off, waiting to see if there would be solid ground beneath her, or a long, unforgiving fall. As she walked off stage, cameras flashing, people reaching out to shake her hand, she felt strangely detached, like she was watching herself from outside her own body. Compliments blurred together. So inspiring, so real. You're incredible. They sounded kind, but also rehearsed, like they were talking to the version of her that had been built for nights exactly like this. She forced a gentle smile, murmured thank you, and kept moving, searching instinctively for one face in particular. When she reached the side corridor leading back toward the balcony, her chest tightened. Empty. He wasn't there. For a brief, disorienting second, disappointment cut sharper than it should have. She'd taken a risk, bared a part of herself, and some quiet part of her had expected, hoped, that he'd still be waiting in that little pocket of honesty they'd carved out earlier. Instead, the hallway stretched ahead, dim and silent, the muffled sound of the party pulsing behind her like a distant heartbeat. She took a slow breath, forcing herself not to feel foolish for wanting that. Maybe this was the lesson. You tell the truth alone, you carry the cost alone. She straightened, ready to walk back to her dressing room and rebuild the armor she just cracked, not realizing that, a few doors away, Keanu was standing in the shadows, wrestling with his own fear, the fear that stepping toward her now might change both of their lives in ways neither of them felt ready to face. He almost turned away. Years of habit pulled him back toward anonymity, the quiet corner, the early exit, the safe distance. But watching her on that stage, hearing the tremor in her voice as she admitted the same kind of emptiness he'd been carrying for years, something in him refused to let this become just another almost connection. Keanu stepped out of the shadowed hallway, just as Charlize lifted her hand to push open the dressing room door, ready to slip back into solitude. "Hey," he said softly. She froze, then turned. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the gala thudded faintly through the walls, like a different world on the other side of a thin veil. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her makeup, flawless from a distance, held the subtle strain of having held back tears. "You weren't on the balcony," she said quietly, the tiniest edge of hurt in her tone, one she hadn't intended to reveal. Realizing how that sounded, she shook her head quickly, embarrassed. "I mean, I thought you might have left." Keanu swallowed, hearing more in those words than she meant to give away. "I was listening from the back," he answered. "Didn't want to be another camera in your face when you walked off stage." He let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "Didn't expect you to set the entire room on fire with that much honesty, though." There was admiration in his voice, but also concern, the kind that comes from knowing how unforgiving the world can be when someone dares to be vulnerable. She leaned against the door, the cool handle under her hand grounding her. "I don't know if it was brave or just reckless," she admitted. "Tomorrow, they'll cut it into sound bites. Charlize opens up about loneliness. They'll spin it into some story about strength, or mystery, or drama." Her mouth twisted. "They'll use it to sell something. And still, tonight, when I go home, it'll just be me and the silence again." She hadn't planned to say that last part. It slipped out like a confession to herself as much as to him. Keanu stepped a little closer, careful not to crowd her, but close enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence. "You know what I heard," he said. "Not headlines. Not spin. I heard someone stand in a room full of people who are used to pretending and say, 'I'm tired of pretending.' You didn't disappear tonight. You did the opposite." He paused, searching her face. "You let them see you. That's terrifying. And it matters." His eyes softened. "It mattered to me." The words sat there, dense with meaning. Charlize looked at him, really looked, and saw the risk he was taking too. It wasn't his style to lean in, to name things so directly. She realized this moment cost him something as well, the safety of being the quiet, kind man in the background, never too entangled, never too needed. "But what do I do with that?" she whispered. "With feeling this exposed? I can't just go back to pretending like nothing changed." It did. At least for me it did. He considered her for a long beat, then made a decision that startled even him. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get out of here." Her brows knit. "I can't just leave. They're expecting me to stay, to mingle, to—" He cut in, but softly. "You already gave them what they came for. More than that, actually. You gave them something real. Let them handle the after-party performance without you for once." A flicker of defiance crossed her expression, warring with a lifetime of obligation and control. "And go where?" she asked. He smiled, small and almost shy. "Somewhere quiet. Somewhere no one expects anything from you. We can just be two humans who survived a long night." It sounded almost too simple, but that was exactly what made the offer so radical. No red carpet, no interviews, no curated narrative. Just a pause. A breath. Company. For a second, fear surged up in her like a reflex. Every instinct she'd built screamed at her to maintain control, to stay in the role, to not be seen leaving with someone in a way that would ignite rumors by morning. But then another voice spoke up, quieter, truer. "Isn't this what you said you wanted? To stop performing your life?" She looked at him, at the open, steady patience in his eyes, at the humility in the way he waited for her decision instead of pushing. He wasn't rescuing her. He was inviting her to rescue herself, with him simply walking beside her. "Okay," she said, exhaling. "Let's go." They slipped out through a service corridor, avoiding the main exits. No photographers waited there, only a tired stagehand rolling a cart of equipment and giving them a polite, indifferent nod. In the elevator down to the parking level, neither of them spoke at first. The silence, surprisingly, didn't feel awkward. It felt like a soft blanket being pulled over the raw edges of the evening. When the doors opened, the low hum of the city wrapped around them. Cool air, the smell of asphalt, distant sirens, a strange but welcome normalcy after hours under chandeliers and spotlights. They ended up at a small, dimly lit diner a few blocks away, the kind of place where no one cared who they were as long as they tipped well and didn't take up too many tables. A waitress with tired eyes and a sincere smile dropped menus on their table without a hint of recognition. It was a relief so sharp it was almost painful. Charlize slid into the booth, feeling the tension in her shoulders slowly unwind. Keanu shrugged off his jacket, placed it on the seat beside him, and for the first time that night, let his posture relax completely. "You know," she said, looking around at the faded posters on the walls, the chipped mugs, the lonely man stirring his coffee at the counter. "If my publicist could see me right now, she'd probably schedule an intervention." He chuckled. "Mine would just send me a script about a guy who runs away to a diner and finds himself." The joke landed softly, easing them both further into the comfort of this unremarkable place. As the waitress poured coffee, the conversation shifted, from careers and obligations to childhood memories, to the strange, winding paths that had brought them here. Charlize spoke, for the first time in years, about the fear that had shaped her early life, about the night everything changed, about how she'd built her sense of safety on work and control. Keanu listened without interruption, his eyes never leaving hers, his presence a quiet anchor. When it was his turn, he shared more than he usually did, not the polished version of his losses, but the raw, messy way they had carved into him, the guilt he still carried for things that had never been his fault, the way he tried to outrun grief by staying in constant motion. There were long pauses where neither of them spoke, just sat with what had been said. Those silences weren't empty. They were full, of respect, of processing, of two people learning how to sit with someone else's pain without trying to fix it. At one point, she reached across the table and lightly touched his hand, a small, instinctive gesture of gratitude. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his palm slightly, just enough that their fingers met, then rested there, quiet and steady. "That one kind thing you do every day," she said softly. "I think this might be one of them. For me." Keanu shook his head. "This isn't charity, Charlize. This is two people being less alone. That's all." His humility disarmed her more than any grand gesture could have. By the time they stepped back out into the night, the city had thinned. Fewer cars, fewer voices. The sky over Los Angeles glowed with that strange, artificial dusk that never fully becomes darkness. They walked to the curb, where their cars waited separately. The practical moment arrived, the one where most connections dissolve. "Good night, see you around," the casual exit that returns everything to normal. Instead, she hesitated. "You know how you said you keep your distance?" she asked, studying him. "And I said I try to control everything." He nodded. "What if we try something different?" she continued, voice unsure but brave. "What if, without big labels or expectations, we just don't do those things? Not with each other. We don't disappear. We don't control. We just keep showing up, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's scary." Her proposal hung in the cool air, simple and enormous. For him, it meant risking more loss. For her, it meant surrendering some of her carefully maintained control. He searched her eyes, looking for any trace of performance, of ulterior motive. He found only a tired, hopeful sincerity that mirrored his own. Slowly, he nodded. "We can try," he said. "No promises about perfect. Just honest." She exhaled, some quiet knot in her chest loosening. "Honest," she agreed. They said good night, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning written in small, human letters instead of neon lights. In the weeks that followed, their lives remained public, messy, loud. There were still premieres, interviews, long days on set. The world, of course, continued to speculate, to project its own fantasies onto them. But beneath that noise, something steady grew. Late-night phone calls after brutal days. Coffee on trailer steps between takes. Texts that said, simply, "You okay?" and answered, honestly, "Not really," without fear of being too much. They didn't magically heal each other. This wasn't a fairy tale where love fixes everything overnight. But in the quiet spaces, they found something rarer. A friendship rooted in truth, where kindness didn't demand a performance, where courage meant admitting fear, where humility allowed them to say, "I'm struggling," without shame. They became, in ways the outside world couldn't quite define, each other's reminder that fame didn't have to erase their humanity. Years later, when asked about the other in interviews, they would smile a certain way, soft, knowing, a little private. They'd choose their words carefully, protecting what they'd built. "We've known each other a long time," one would say. "There's a lot of love and respect there," the other would add. The world would nod, interpret, invent its own versions of the story. But the untold truth, the one that lived only between them, was this. On a night when both of them were tired of pretending, they chose not to look away from each other's pain. They chose honesty over distance, connection over control. And from that choice grew a kind of beautiful connection that didn't need a label or a spotlight to be real. Only two people willing, again and again, to keep showing up, with kindness, courage, humility, and the quiet resilience of hearts that had finally decided they didn't have to hide anymore.